6, 5, 4, 3.
Okay, Ralph. So what's your association with Fitzroy?
Well, I moved in 75, came from a little country town called Kilmore, and I found a little country town, sort of, in the middle of the city. I've been here more or less ever since. Was mayor in 84, 85 and councillor 82, 87, and I fell in love with it.
Okay. So you think that Fitzroy has similarities to the country town where you grew up?
It did, much less so now.
Yeah.
When I moved in, Fitzroy was pretty rough. On one side was the exhibition gardens, and on the other side was all the factories in Collingwood.
Yeah.
And of course, all the factories in Collingwood are gone now. Most of the factories in Fitzroy are gone.
Yeah.
They're all prestige apartments.
Yeah.
Almost all.
Yeah. So would you say that that Fitzroy's changed for the worse over the last few years?
I'd actually say it's going through another cycle.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, I remember a taxi driver delivered me down the road and said, "My God, you're at the door of Hell's Kitchen," because of course that was when all the heroin dealing was going on at the bottom of my street, and he said, "Oh God, it must be really rough," and really it was a pretty rough little suburb when I was here, and the phone rings all the time, Craig. Don't worry.
Yeah.
I'll just wait until it finishes. It was a pretty rough suburb when I moved in. Young white boy from the country was minding his P's and Q's as he walked around the streets.
Yeah.
But I've never been beaten up.
Yeah.
Never really even been threatened, although I've had mates who have been beaten up.
Yeah.
And who have been threatened. It can be dangerous. So I saw that period, then it's yupification, and then for a moment, courtesy of the junkies, a slight de-yupification. But really, I'd see it part of a natural progression, really.
Yeah. And so you'd say, so Fitzroy does have its own particular identity, you'd say?
Oh, absolutely. Still, even given all the foreigners from Kew and Hawthorn and Northcote and Thornbury, maybe even Footscray that hang out here over the weekend, especially. The character, there is a real sense of space and place about it, and that's one of the things I like about it. I also like the fact that there are rich and poor, creative and uncreative, old and young. It's a really varied sort of population, and always will be, courtesy of the Housing Commission, and I think because of the sort of place it is.
So that diversity is a sign of tolerance too.
And I guess also a sign that people are welcome here on the way to somewhere else too.
Yeah.
If I think about the different ethnicities, cultural and linguistic diversities in Fitzroy that I've seen, I mean, there were a lot of Turks and Italians and Greeks when I first moved in. Then there were lots of Hmong and Somali, and the list goes on. They've left a few behind each time they've moved in and through the suburb.
So most of the new migrants would come to Fitzroy through the housing commission?
Yeah, almost all of the migrants have come through Fitzroy via the Housing Commission. It's a sad story in itself, really. The Housing Commission was a whole series of other low-rise terrace houses before they started ripping them down in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. So you moved to Fitzroy only a little time after the Housing Commission was built?
Well, yeah, I moved in 75, so it was less than 10 years old at that stage, and there were still people still people living talking about the good old days of the demonstrations against the Housing Commission.
Yeah.
But we had the good old days of the demonstrations against the freeway to look forward to by that stage, because they didn't happen until around 77, 78, and the big fights and the big demos in Alexandra Parade. What's what we call it anyway. You could call it the Eastern Freeway now, because we lost.
Yeah. Do you think that Fitzroy still got that ability or will even to protest that changes that happen within the community?
That's an interesting question. Fitzroy has always had its own special politics, and it's always been slightly eccentric. It's either always been a little bit left of centre or a little bit right of centre. The Fitzroy Labor Party branches, there were 3 of them in the 50s and through until the big Labor Party split, and most of the 3 branches actually joined the Democratic Labor Party. They're on the right. They used to joke about the Fitzroy Labor Party branch as meeting in the phone box because they wouldn't bother getting the key unless they had 2 or 3 people turn up for a quorum. But that was because North Fitzroy had a minority of people who did actually stay with the Labor Party. But later on, the Labor Party was taken over by the ultra-leftists. In the early 80s, the Marxist discussion group decided that they were going to do an entryist Trotskyist takeover of the Fitzroy branch. They discovered it was actually hard yakka though. Instead of sitting around talking, they had to knock on doors. So yeah, Fitzroy's always had more of its swings and roundabouts. I mean, it went from while it was still its own separate municipality, it went from being 15 Labor Party people through to something like 11 or 12 out of 15 being independent. In only a very, very small number of years.
And you were pretty much one of the last mayors?
I was the last Labor mayor of Fitzroy.
Yeah.
There were a few independents after me.
Yeah. When was that?
Well, that was 84, 85.
Yeah.
And I guess I was famous or notorious for being so scandalously open about myself as to say that I was openly gay. And that was only a simple point really. I wanted to avoid being blackmailed. It was only a few years later when a closeted gay councillor came to me, rather strangely complaining to me about being blackmailed out of the mayoralty because of his gayness. Of course, it's only hearsay, but it says something about politics and about Fitzroy. I mean, I was only the first openly gay councillor. In a public sense, there were lots of people with lots of different characters on the Fitzroy Council. It had more women councillors. I think it was the first council with a majority of women councillors at one stage. It had the first Italian. It had Monteverde had the first Greek mayor. So in that sense, it was always a pathfinding council and a pathfinding sort of area.
So was there difficulties in being openly gay in Fitzroy?
It was a lot easier in Fitzroy than it would have been elsewhere. The Herald Sun managed to find a couple of people to grumble about me being honest about myself, but basically everybody was cool about it. It was a tricky one because, I didn't realise I was being quite as brave as I might have been until the odd death threat arrived.
Really?
But there were only a few. And that was mainly a comment about their own problems and their own sense of discomfort about themselves, I would have thought, rather than any comment about me. In fact, I really should be known as the mayor that helped to reduce the deficit from 2 million to 300,000 in 1 year, but nobody ever remembers that.
Yeah. And do you think that the character of Fitzroy has changed since the town hall closed down and they formed the mega council?
I was always very strongly in support of forming a bigger municipal area, not because I wanted to lose the sense of Fitzroy, but because Fitzroy had the highest rates. And that was actually having an effect in terms of the cost of housing and the cost of doing business in Fitzroy. And really, in the end, it was hard to justify on an economic basis the notion of a separate council. And I always thought that Fitzroy would keep its own separate and distinct character after it lost its own council, and I think it has. Unfortunately, some of it's in and around Brunswick Street and those hordes of foreigners from the other suburbs that I was talking about before. But even if you get away from that, there is a sense of locality and of community that doesn't exist in a lot of Melbourne or a lot of Australia.
Mm. Do you think that has a lot to do with how Fitzroy is designed as a suburb?
Well, Fitzroy wasn't really designed in some senses. The government made the big streets, and all the private developers